Hello, Mark Hill from Greenleaves. So I wanted to talk tonight about this quote from Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, who's a sort of conservative from Poland, ex-Prime Minister, President there, and member of the European People's Party, the Christian Democrat group. He is not to be confused with Jean-Claude Juncker, who is the Luxembourgeois President, again a member of the European People's Party, that is, instead of being president of the European Council, he is president of the European Commission. Donald Tusk is more closely related to the presidents and prime ministers, the Chancellor in the case of Germany, Frau Merkel, that actually really decide how the European Union as a whole is going to deal with Britain and Brexit. He recently said, "By the way, I have been wondering what that special place in hell looks like for those who promoted Brexit without even a sketch of a plan how to carry it out safely." Now, in the context, he was talking about Northern Ireland and the possibility if the backstop isn't agreed, which it looks like it won't be agreed, by the British legislators, that there could then be a hard border, a European Union built series of border posts along the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland border, which would be against the 2012 Common Travel Agreement Acts that were passed in both Britain and Ireland, and would be against the spirit of earlier accords that preceded it, with open travel even being maintained during the difficulties in the 60s and 70s, the troubles between nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland. This slightly surreal quote was made completely odd by the comment immediately afterwards by yet another European leader, Guy Verhofstadt, who is a Belgian sort of liberal, really. He said, "I doubt Lucifer would welcome them," talking about Brexit supporters, "as after what they did to Britain, they would even manage to divide hell." Slightly surreal. We're getting some very curious insults, presumably a reflection of the desperation of the times. But at the nub of the arguments both of them have with Brexit supporters and promoters, so we were in the boxing industry or something, it is this allegation that we didn't have a plan. And unfortunately, people think there's no smoke without fire. We all know that allegations like this, once made, are very difficult to disprove, particularly if they are repeated often. A lie repeated often becomes the truth, and another analogy is that mud sticks. So I think the best way I can address this is to just reassure you, dear listener, that there were lots of plans at the heart of the campaign that certainly I was a part of, and 52% of the British people supported. So we'll start off with a few. Now, the founding organisation behind Vote Leave was in fact a business group called Business for Britain, founded by Matthew Alias, who then became chief executive of Vote Leave, and this was the plan that they worked to, which was, at this early stage, was a mixture of opposition to the European Union as it was currently created, concerns about some of the blocks, some of the opportunities that were being missed, a series of suggestions about the way that Cameron, who then was Prime Minister, should regard the European Union while he was trying to seek reforms that might have secured enduring British membership of the EU. And then also talked, particularly in the latter parts, about the way that we might leave and what the advantages of that would be. Both with our relationships with the European Union and with the wider world. And this is the sort of thing a plan looks like. It's got a big index and contents page, it's got the people who've written it, it's got screen to text, it's got some diagrams, which is always useful, tables, charts. Does that look like a plan to you? Now, you might say, well, that's a bit thin. It's not as thin as the broadsheet that went out along with it, which was just decided like this to just sort of whet the appetite, really. But, there's the centrefold there, which is a huge pictorial diagram of why we'll be better off outside the European Union as the 5th largest independent economy in the world, and therefore able to plough our own furrow and also perhaps do some good in the world. So that was their plan, but of course, thin as it is, this had to be underpinned by something, so there was an enormous version of this book issued largely online, and that came to a staggering 1,032 pages. Lots of plan, including several mentions of Northern Ireland. There was plenty of planning done by parts of the left. The Anti-Maastricht Alliance, the campaign against Euro-federalism was certainly bodies that I've known for many years. Perhaps it was the UK Independence Party that Donald Tusk had in his mind when he was thinking about promoters. But then many of their senior people also had plans. Now, one of them is a certain Richard North, who wrote a book here with Christopher Booker of The Telegraph. This is called The Great Deception. Now, this is actually a history of the European Union, but this weighs in at a stonking 450 odd pages worth of text, which I've read. And this was a predecessor to other books that both of them have read, including in particular Richard North's plan, which I don't have a copy of here, but it is available online, which was called Flexit, which is a flexible way of leaving the European Union. He envisaged us leaving in stages, including going through various organisations, in particular EFTA. Actually quite a moderate plan, really, if you think about the radicalism of the UK Independence Party position. That was 407 pages, so scarcely a sketch, I would say. There were economists, and of course economists tend to write at great length. Here's a guy called Roger Bootle, who is perhaps a right-wing economist. He wrote a book here which is at 330 pages, one of many books that he's written about the European Union, and comments in the newspapers as well. Perhaps he's not to your taste because he's a bit too right-wing. Well, there's this guy here, there's John Mills, who's been writing for years relatively small books like this, much more accessible, but still with charts and still with diagrams and tables, and these quite pithily written 100 pages go into various things that can be done about the European Union. Perhaps he was thinking of conservatives. Now, probably one of the top cheerleaders for the Conservative Party is the member of the European Parliament, Daniel Hannan, who wrote 2 books that bookcased the referendum, wrote Why Vote Leave beforehand, and once we had decided to vote leave, what next afterwards. And this is quite a moderate book, and again has plenty of, certainly more than a sketch, as you can see. It's got quite a lot of text in there, not as densely written and academic as some, quite accessible and quite speculative in some cases, and perhaps a bit of a lightweight at only 293 pages. Perhaps he's talking about things other than plans. I mean, it could be that he's despairing of Brexit supporting MPs. Now, the MPs did at least, whatever one thinks about their recent performance, they did at least quite clearly decide to firstly have the referendum following the 2015 general election. 316 to 53 voted in favour of having the referendum in 2016, which we then did. The notification of withdrawal, which was the formal decision to pass the Article 50 decision, was passed by a stonking 494 MPs to only 122. perhaps Donald Tusk is criticising them for not having enough of a plan. But it seems to me that the legislation that was passed at the same time was really fairly thorough. It's clear that we're going to be leaving on the 29th of March. It's also very clear how we're expecting the legislation to be incorporated into British legislation, at least in the interim, and thereafter we will follow what we will follow and we will not follow what we will not follow, but it will be on the basis of British parliamentary decisions. And certainly it seems to be envisaged that we will in future discuss trade treaties, and those will go up in front of the Commons. Now all of that suits me fine. The dialogue and debate that's busted up ever since the notification of withdrawal, which is reaching an ever crazier head at the moment, but appears to be about very little. It's not particularly dignified, but then perhaps the MPs are regretting their decision, 494 of them to 122, to actually enact the decision that the British people gave them, which was obviously to leave. And they are alarmed at the fact that the European Union isn't giving them a deal, or at least not a very good one. So perhaps it seems to me that there isn't really a good place to place, a good person to place this blame that Donald Tusk wants to place. Brexiteers aren't the cause, really, of the lack of a plan. There are plenty of plans, and arguably the legislative minimum has been done by the MPs. No, it seems to me that the place where the planning has been particularly poor is actually in the European Union itself, which is why they carry on going on about this relatively minor issue, that is whether or not we may or may not need border guards around the border in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, whether or not the European Union wants to essentially make the Republic of Ireland pay for border posts and barbed wire, which seems bonkers considering we've had free travel there for centuries. Or whether we should in fact be thinking about some of the much bigger issues, the much more involved issues, the ones which where there is potentially very creative solutions about all the other many ways in which we interact with the European Union. Are they distracted by this one tiny issue because they can't just get their heads around the magnitude of the issues that they could potentially be legislating about, agreeing about, on all of the other topics? And they're caught like a rabbit in the headlights by the prospect of the second largest contributor, one of the major economies and major diplomatic and political powers in the European Union, simply walking away at a time when the European Union has huge other pressures, including almost rebellion from some of its Eastern European members, huge structural inequality in Southern Europe, huge economic dislocation with the single currency, pressure from its failed migration policy, all sorts of diplomatic pressure, not least from the East, and a general rise in populism which threatens to remove many of them from power at the May Euro elections anyway. Now, it seems to me that the person who needs to be researching that special place in hell is probably Donald Tusk, because he himself is the man without the sketch of a plan.